Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And those of you who are regular attenders at Travel Talks over the years, you'll know that usually during Christian Aid Week in May, I try and have a speaker from Christian Aid. So I'm delighted that this year is the same. And well, not quite the same. We're on Zoom. So Andrew, thank you so much. I'd like to introduce Andrew Jenkins, who has great experience with Christian Aid and working actually in where he's going to talk about today. So Myanmar and Bangladesh, only the other way around, I think. So a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. That's lovely. So Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tricia, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'll be careful to stick to the time. So I'm a volunteer speaker for Christian Aid. I've worked in development in South and Southeast Asia since 1975. And I'm going to talk today about two partner organizations of Christian Aid in particular, and then some Christian Aid work in the Rohingya refugee camps and some other pressing issues concerning Christian Aid, which we'll get to later. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm now going to share the screen. I think you'll still see me, but in the corner, and we'll see some of the slides. And then after the break, I'll have some more slides, but I'm also showing a couple of short videos, one of which we made ourselves based on some work in Myanmar, which I'll explain later. So thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you find this enjoyable and illuminating. So this talk is called Real People, Real Change. It's because this year is the 75th anniversary of Christian Aid, which started with providing help to war-ravaged Europe 75 years ago, and then developed into support for people around the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and South America. Yeah, so Christian Aid I was speaking in our local church on Sunday, and we started from the Gospel of Matthew, love your neighbor as yourself, and Christian Aid is very much about our global neighbors. We all are very involved, I think, many of us during the pandemic with our neighbors nearby, but it's very important, I think, to remember our global neighbors, and Christian Aid and modern technology gives us opportunities to express love for them too. And that's the basis of what Christian Aid does, and also the basis of my talk. The reason I'm talking about Bangladesh and Myanmar is I've worked in 6 states in India, extensively in Bangladesh, a little bit in Nepal, and then in all the countries of mainland Southeast Asia, that is Laos for 6 years, also Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And out of those, I thought there are 2 partner organizations of Christian Aid, which which I've had a lot of experience with, and which I think are wonderful organizations. And I thought that would be a good focus. But I will touch on a few other points as well, which I'll explain as we go along. So these are called Nijirakori, that's in Bangladesh. It's written in Bangla at the top, and then in English. And it means we do it ourselves. And it's very focused on working with the poorest and most disadvantaged and supporting them to become more organized, more informed about their rights and about their situation and about how they can change it, and then working together to bring about change, which I'll explain a bit more about shortly. And then in Myanmar, it's the Metta Development Foundation. This is a very interesting organization. Metta means loving kindness in Burmese. And this was started primarily by people from the areas in the north and east, which are not ethnically predominantly Burmese. Myanmar is an interesting country because it has a lowland area with a large Burmese population, and then a large mountainous area with a number of different ethnic groups, predominantly Karen, Kachin, Shan, but quite a large number of other ethnic groups as well. And since before the independence of the country, there have been tensions between these, basically between these two different areas. With the army, very often the Burmese army, which is very strongly ethnically Burmese, dominating other parts of the country and exploiting it, as we will see later on. So Meta was founded at the stage when things started opening up in Burma. Very sadly, there's been a recent military coup and a new clampdown. So we're back to authoritarian and quite brutal military rule. But some time ago, it was opening up, which led to the election of Aung San Suu Kyi's party. And that created, for the first time in recent years, opportunities for civil society or non-government organizations. And that was when Meta was founded, very much with the intention of having a composition from all the ethnic groups, which has generally been the case, particularly from the ones in the upland areas, and also from different religious minorities, including Christians as well as Buddhists. So they've been working since that time and are now working, continuing to work in quite a difficult situation. So these are the two partners that I'm going to talk about today. And this is a little bit about me. I'm an agricultural engineer. I first went to Bangladesh in 1975 to work in a famine. I came back to England in 1980 and studied agricultural engineering at Cranfield University. And I've altogether been working for 40 years in rural development with a focus on water management and water engineering, but also on project evaluation, particularly impact evaluation, which I'll also talk about later. And we moved back to England in 2017, and we went to a Christians Aware conference in Swanwick. I was talking to Tricia about this a couple of days ago, and there was a Christian Aid stall, and we started talking to them, and they asked me to become a volunteer speaker. So I've been a volunteer speaker for Christian Aid since 2018. I'm still working in South and Southeast Asia, not for Christian Aid. I'm not employed by them. I'm a volunteer. But that's brought me into contact with a lot of the work of Christian Aid. So I have direct experience, which I'll explain as we go along. So we'll start with coastal Bangladesh, highly vulnerable to climate change, which will be a theme we'll return to a bit later. You can see me there. If I look different today, it's because those were taken a while ago. In the 80s, when we first started working there, our family lived in that area, south of the town, about 30 kilometers south of the town, for 6 years. And if you just bear with me for a second, I may be getting a message. So. Okay, it was a message from Tricia, and I don't think it's for me, so that's okay.
Sorry about that. I should have texted Pete on a different one. Sorry.
That's okay. No problem. I thought there might be something urgent you wanted to tell me.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, no problem. So you can see there on the right-hand side the kind of very flat, very wet area in the northeastern corner of the Bay of Bengal. And you can see in the left, that's actually a meeting with the large number of landless farmers who are about to receive new ownership rights to new land emerging out of the sea, which is the focus of the project I'm going to talk about. And that's explaining to them how this is going to work. That was a really good day. You can see the Dutch ambassador behind me because the Netherlands was supporting our activities at that point. And he was very enthusiastic. And on the right-hand side is a bridge that we built within the project area. And we'll talk about infrastructure in a minute or two. So coastal Bangladesh is now highly vulnerable to climate change. It's always been highly vulnerable to extreme weather events. going back to at least the 17th century. We have records of very destructive cyclonic storm surges. But it's also an area which is potentially highly productive and can provide food and livelihood for people. So it's important that it's developed and settled properly. So my wife and I and our small kids, actually they were born during this period, lived together and worked with people in this area and with the Christian Aid partner, Nijirakori, initially from 1982 to 88. And then, and actually I continued in the project to 1990. And then from 2017 until now, and I'm still working in this area. I'll be back there again when the pandemic permits. And this is a joint team involving people from civil society NGO organizations, involving government staff, consultants, and local leaders from organizations set up to make sure the land is properly allocated, and also the water is effectively managed and the water-related infrastructure is maintained and operates to optimize agricultural production. On the left-hand side, second from the left, is Sohrab Hussain. He's a very old friend, and we've worked together in 4 similar projects in the coastal zone of Bangladesh. Now, a word about Nijirakori. Nijirakori concentrates on mobilizing poor, disadvantaged people to claim their entitlements and demand their rights. This is quite a theme with quite a number of Christian Aid partner organizations, a commitment and dedication to working with the poorest and most disadvantaged, and also a focus on trying to help them to change their position in society and also change their economic and livelihood conditions, also during the current global pandemic, because they tend to be left out from other forms of development unless they're able to put forward and explain their needs and their rights. So Nijirakori means we do it ourselves, and it's very effective as an organization at connecting local issues with national policies and bringing local marginalized, unheard voices into dialogue with policymakers. Kushi Kubir is the director. I've known her since, I think, 1976. She's very effective at helping people to put their points and raise their voices at national level. Her father was a very respected minister, non-political minister in the 1970s, and also a very effective director of the National Family Planning Organization, which had a tremendously positive effect in making family planning services widely available. And that has led to a tremendous reduction in fertility and in the population growth rate, which is important in a small country with 155 million people. So she's been able to use her access at a high level as a campaigner within the government and actually internationally as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see a recent initiative mobilizing youth against violence in Bangladesh. That was an initiative that Nijirakori took. This is very important. Domestic violence is a major problem, primarily violence against women. It needs to be combated. And there's an additional element. I was doing research in another Bangladeshi organization into factors affecting achieving the Millennium Development Goals. One of the most important Millennium Development Goals is reducing maternal mortality during childbirth. And the health program in that organization had done an analysis which showed that the highest mortality was in the age group of mothers under 16, which is quite shocking because the age of marriage is 18. So these girls should not be having babies. They're too young. Their bodies are not fully developed enough, and it causes a high mortality rate. So why is it happening? Well, it happens, at least one of the important factors, it happens because we know that from the research that there's quite a strong link between high school dropouts and early marriage and early pregnancy, and in some cases, death during childbirth. So why do girls drop out? A major factor is harassment from boys who think it's amusing and funny to harass girls and make suggestive comments while they're on the way to and from high schools from home. And that results in a dropout. Girls end up back at home. Parents think she's not doing anything anymore, she's not studying anymore, let's arrange a marriage. She gets married, has an early pregnancy, and she's at risk, very significant higher risk from miscarriage and death during childbirth. So mobilizing youth against violence and sexual harassment is very important. When it's explained to boys effectively and also within the community, it's possible to reduce it massively, and that has a really positive effect on the lives of teenage girls. So that's one example of Nijirokori activities as a Christian Aid partner. And I'm going to talk a bit more about another one, which relates very much to the work that I did then and the work that I'm still doing, or I've returned to do now. So this is newly accreted land with a protective embankment and forest belts. You can see, get a very good impression of the area in the northeast Bay of Bengal. On the middle of the picture, you can see a kind of curving line of trees. That's actually a flood protection embankment, which has had trees planted on the slopes. On the left-hand side, you can see big forest belts, which have been deliberately planted. That's to reduce the energy of cyclonic storm surges, because cyclones cause a great deal of wind damage. We'll see an example in a minute, but the effect on mortality is the tidal surge. So because of the combination of the weather conditions, the cyclone, barometric pressure, wind speeds, and so on, and the stage in the tidal cycle, cyclones can produce surges of up to 6 meters high, coming in as a standing wave or a moving wave faster than people can run. And that's when we get very high mortality rates. And the forest belts are very effective at reducing the energy in the storm surge. So by the time the water reaches the embankment has a chance to resist them and to reduce the impact of the cyclone. The embankments are not always successful. They're actually designed for the normal tides to protect flooding against flooding caused by the normal tides with a range of about 4 meters. So they don't always effective against the largest cyclones. So we have another solution to that, and I'll explain that in a moment. And in the foreground, you can see the area subject to repeated tidal flooding. It's very different from the area in the background, as you can see, which is protected by the embankment, because it's very newly accreted. It's very newly come out of the sea. And there's a river in the middle with a sluice higher up where you can see that that's open to the tide, and it allows the rainwater to come out of the area behind the embankment. Now, this is where the sediments come from, and this is where, in a sense, the opportunity arises. Bangladesh is a delta with an alluvial soil, hundreds or even thousands of meters deep because of sedimentation. These sediments have been laid down over thousands of years, and they're still being laid down because they're still coming out of the high Himalaya during periods of snowmelt when soil particles are detached, flow into the streams and rivers, come down the huge rivers. As you can see here, this is the northeastern side of India. All the really big rivers end up in a small area of Bangladesh, and in particular in the southeastern delta, which is where I've been working. And so that the final river, which is a conjunction of all the big rivers, is absolutely enormous and has a huge sediment load. So it's continuously creating new land out of the sea, but land also is being eroded. So land's being lost in some places and gained in others. And with the effect of climate change and rising sea levels, it's very important that we develop the new land in a way which is effective and equitable, so that people who lose their land in one place can move and resettle effectively and live productive lives and grow food in another place. So the solution is a partnership between government, donor organizations, and civil society. The main elements that we need to undertake are to organize landless people, to ensure fair land allocation, develop infrastructure, and improve agriculture, education, and health. Because these areas start off with no institutions, no agriculture, no infrastructure at all. All of this has to emerge. And the people who are settling, who have lost their land elsewhere, are very active in undertaking these things, but a lot of other investments need to be made as well. And primarily, they need to be very well organized to make sure that they actually obtain the land in a fair and equitable way. Each family gets the same amount, because traditionally, land has been settled through a kind of combination of terrorism and corruption, basically by large landowners who end up owning the new land and using the settlers as tenants. So the role of Nigerikori in the 1980s was to organize landless people and to push very hard for the law to be applied and for land to be distributed fairly and permanently to these people. And I was working with them from in the context of a government project funded by the Netherlands. So I was able to cooperate with them. In fact, I invited them to come into this area and work on the problem from the other side, from the bottom up, when I was working from it on the same problem from within the government. So you can see that unprotected land is highly vulnerable to tidal flooding with rising sea levels. It's very traumatic when it happens. Of course, you get spring tides twice a month, and then during certain times of year, very high water levels. And on a flat country, you can see how devastating that can be. The solution is to build earth embankments, as in the Netherlands, for example, to protect against tidal flooding, and sluices, which I didn't mention in the slide, which are very important. They allow the water to come out, the rainwater to come out, while keeping the seawater out using flap gates. Also slide gates to retain water during the monsoon season, so we can use it for irrigation in the dry season. Building roads, bridges, culverts, digging channels, which are very important because they comprise the drainage system, which means we can effectively control the water. And now the area is even more vulnerable to more frequent and more destructive cyclones. You can see the satellite image on the left. That was Cyclone Sida in 2006, I think. And I went down to the area hit by the cyclone. I got there, I think, about 24 hours after the cyclone occurred. And that was a school. It used to be a school. And you can see what happened to it. That was even without the storm surge. That was just the wind damage. So we have a major problem with vulnerability to to cyclones. And the solution is the construction of safe refuges in a school come cyclone shelter. That's very specifically designed. You can see that the lower story is open. That's so that people don't take refuge in the lower story during a period of a cyclone, which might lead to a cyclonic storm surge, because the lower story would be a dangerous place to be. You need to be in the upper story, or even if there's a very extreme event, you can close the shutters and you can actually get up through an internal staircase onto the roof, which has a high parapet. So in the worst case, you can gather on the roof. But in most cases, the first floor is safe, and people need to get into there before the storm surge occurs. Provides protection against wind damage, but it's primarily there to stop people from dying during the storm surge. And there have been major cyclones in the past which have killed hundreds of thousands of people. So having a network of these shelters and a very effective warning system where the radio, the National Meteorological Organization broadcasts warnings on the radio for people to get into the shelters, particularly with small children and so on, not leave it to the last moment, and then they will survive the cyclonic storm surge and can start to rebuild their lives after it. So that's an important element. And then here we have work with the Forest Department. The Forest Department has a major role in this area of raising seedlings for mangrove shelter belts, which I showed in a previous slide. And that's very important to absorb the energy, and it's also good for the overall kind of ecology of the area. And this is very important. Before we initiated this project, people who were trying to settle this new land were basically digging ponds to produce earth to raise their houses. I'll show you one of those a bit later. And those ponds could also provide water, but the water was generally pretty contaminated and dirty. And then in the winter season, when there's no rain, the water table dropped, the water's drained out of the bottom of the pond. So the pond was empty, but the water table was a little bit below the bottom of the pond. So people would dig a further hole in the bottom of the pond, and that's where they would get their drinking water. So it was a really very laborious and contaminated system. We can drill these wells manually, surprisingly, to a depth of 300 meters, 1,000 feet. Down there, there's a freshwater aquifer. Before there are aquifers, but they're saline, salty. But we can get to the 300-meter aquifer, put in a screen at that level, put on a simple hand pump at the top, which has been redesigned recently by UNICEF to last a very long time with very heavy use, because several families will be using one pump. And there are now thousands of these, and I'm currently working on installing another 1,100 in the next year or two throughout the area, so that families don't have to go more than about 30 meters to access clean water. This is very important, and also initiative to install safe pit latrines for sanitation as well, which are very important, and also very important for particularly for women in terms of kind of amenity, rather than having to go out into the fields at dawn for defecation, which is, you know, very unpleasant. And so every family needs a safe pit latrine. So the ponds provide a big opportunity for development of fisheries. So that's a very important activity as well. And those ponds are developed during the house construction, because you need to raise a platform on which to build a house. And agricultural development is a key area. Here we can see duck raising. You may not think ducks are important, but in fact in the coastal zone and certainly in the northeastern part of Bangladesh, which is a large depression, duck raising is a major activity and can be quite an important, very important source of income. And then on the right, there's an expression called sorjan. Sorjan means developing trenches and raised beds. On the raised beds, you can grow high value crops like beans on trellises. So you can see the trellis on the slide. And fresh water is retained because there's high rainfall during the monsoon. So fresh water is retained in the trenches, and you can also produce fish in the trenches. So this is a way of maximizing production in a limited area, because Bangladesh has a very high population and limited land area. So the land allocation for the new settlers is around, I think it's 0.6 of a hectare. So that's about just over an acre. Yeah, just over an acre. But if you use these highly productive methods, you can still produce a very effective, very rewarding livelihood from them. And this point is extremely important. This is assignment of land titles. So on the left, you can see a family, a couple, young couple, who got the land title, extremely happy, holding it up. One innovation in this project, which was very much part of Nijera Kuri's campaign in the 1980s, was that women would get land titles as well as men. And in fact, when I was working there at that time, I went out one day to do some surveying, and a woman ran after me and started shouting at me. I tried to find out why she was so upset. And she was so upset because she discovered that the land allocation was going on and she was not going to get any because her husband had died. And in those days, only heads of families, which were men, got land. And I couldn't change the land law at that stage, but I did control a kind of research plot of 100 acres, 40 hectares. So I suggested to her that we organize a cooperative of widows, and we organized a cooperative of 30 widows, and they still exist. which is now more than 30 years later, and they have the right to that land in their own names. And that was the first start of equity in land distribution. And then later on, the whole legal system was changed through administrative order. And currently, husbands and wives get land jointly. Widows are also eligible, but in the majority are married and they get the land jointly. And the deed is written in both names and the wife's name is written first. And the divorce rate has gone right down because divorce was normally initiated by men who wanted to go somewhere else and maybe have another family, or they wanted to leave their wives and so on. They don't anymore, because if they do, they lose their land as well. So that's been very important. And on the right-hand side, you can see a recent meeting with women wearing masks because it's during the pandemic. And it's a meeting to discuss and make sure that people who are getting new land titles, wives actually understand their rights under the land law, that they have an equal right to the land, and also their rights under family law. So if there is any possibility of divorce, they know what benefits they will get as a result and make sure that they're properly treated. So we're coming close to the time limit. I think we've got 5 minutes left. I've got a little bit more to explain. So that's new land and new life. And you can see how productive this area can be when it's brought under settlement in a fair and effective way. So then I'm going to talk for the last 5 minutes about Christian Aid's work also in Bangladesh with Rohingya refugees. As you know, there's a Rohingya refugee crisis, which has been going on now for several years. In fact, it's much older than that. I remember visiting Rohingya refugee camps 30 years ago, but it's got much, much worse in the last 2 or 3 years. So people have fled for their lives across the border into Cox's Bazar. And very importantly, an unknown number of people are displaced in northern Rakhine State in Myanmar. We don't often hear that much about internally displaced people, but it's a huge problem, which I'll mention later. Christian Aid has run a campaign on this. So it's not just the people in Bangladesh, it's also the displaced people inside Myanmar who are living in quite a scary and dangerous situation. Refugees walked for days on end. Many didn't eat during that time. They had no money for food or shelter, and the threat of disease is real. I just looked up the latest figures on COVID-19, and it started to spread seriously in the refugee camps. Humaira walked for 60 kilometers to reach camps in Bangladesh. She was 9 months pregnant, and her husband and father had been killed by the Burmese army or its local paramilitary allies. Very scary and horrible situation. So Christian Aid is working with local partners, both in Myanmar and in Bangladesh, to provide shelter, food, water, and sanitation. Very important. This is a picture of Maruf Shehab. He's a friend of mine. We worked together in another organization in Bangladesh until 2017. We both moved on at roughly the same time. He moved on to Christian Aid, and he explained to me what Christian Aid is doing. So it's focusing on protection and living conditions of refugees. It's focused on well-being and dignity, supporting environmentally sustainable solutions, and building the confidence and resilience of refugees and affected host communities. So just a quick look at how we can help them. So £26 provides food for 15 days, £50 for hygiene kits, and £208 for shelter for 15 families. And then I'd like to talk a bit about the Christian Aid campaign to highlight internally displaced people. Tens of millions of people are left in the dark. 4.5 million people, 40.5 million people are displaced internally due to armed conflict, like the Rohingya conflict and violence. And tens of millions more are displaced every year to hazard-related so-called natural disasters. So Christian Aid has been running a campaign for internally displaced people to encourage states and UN agencies to take positive action and to work with them and not to forget these important people. And I think that is the last slide on Bangladesh, and I will move on to Myanmar after the break. Okay, well, thank you very much. So as I explained at the beginning, I'm talking about two Christian aid partner organizations, one in Bangladesh, Nijrukuri, which we've already discussed, and the second one is called Meta, and it's in Myanmar, and I'm going to share the screen now and talk about that. Right. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, Meta was founded by people from different ethnic minorities coming together to try to work with those people, but also with poor and disadvantaged people in the mainstream Burmese ethnic community. And it's had a difficult time in Myanmar because the Myanmar government, military governments have been quite repressive, but they've been trying to work in the space available to them. And I think in the current situation after the military coup, it's become again very difficult. So this was from the chair of the board, whom I've worked with in the past. She said, in order to move from delivering aid and ending needs, we need to strengthen local actors. We need to provide them space and support them. We should work with them, not around them. So she's talking about how Christian aid works with its partners, which is very much an equal partnership, but also the way larger organizations like Meta will work with local communities in villages and towns in Myanmar. And that's been a very important theme. And I'll come back to that in describing one of the projects I'm going to talk about a bit later. So how do I know these things? Well, I was working in Bangladesh and asked to go to Burma and work with Meta to develop information on outcomes. I'll explain a little bit later what I mean exactly by outcomes. But essentially, Meta was considered by its partners to be very good at carrying out work. It was very good at describing the work that it did, but it wasn't so good at reporting the results. So we need to answer the question, and this is a question I'm quite often asked in Christian aid meetings. In fact, I spoke at a regional conference in York a couple of years ago on how do we know it works? It's quite important. You know, we know what we do, but what happens as a result? And that's very important. So I had been working in a Bangladeshi organization on impact evaluation. So they asked me to go to Burma and to Myanmar and look into that. And as a result, we did a number of outcome case studies. And to describe the results of those outcome case studies, we made a small video, which I'm going to show now. And I'm actually not going to show, I'm going to turn the sound off in the first part because it's got some background music, which may be a bit distracting if we use it in this context. So I'm just going to explain what I normally, what I'm recorded saying in the video and update it a bit. But then I'll actually go back to the video for some clips where you can hear people in Myanmar speaking themselves with subtitles. So if you just bear with me for a second, I'll do that now. So this is about the outcome case studies that we developed for Meta. Meta is as I've explained before, its primary objective is the evolution of self-reliant and peaceful societies through social and economic growth. And the driving force is the concept of loving kindness. It has programs in health, education, agriculture, and livelihood. and it started a kind of overall regeneration initiative in 2009. So it was good at monitoring activities and outputs, and an evaluation suggested that we should look more carefully at outcomes. So each of the branch offices carried out a number of outcome case studies, which my wife and I worked with them to do. And these were collected in a book published by the head office. And we followed a process where defining expected outcomes, identifying indicators, collecting simple data, and analyzing that data so that we could improve the programs and support future organizational learning. So as the capacity developed, each regional office developed a team which was pretty good at this. And we then moved on later on to another research project, which I'll talk about later. So this video explains how that worked. So we used a very simple scheme, starting with defining objectives.
Andrew, can I just interrupt you a second? Are we supposed to be seeing the video now?
Yeah, can you not see it?
No, we've still got your outcome case studies screen up.
Okay. Well,
so
sorry.
maybe you need to come out of that, do you, and then go back in again
Yes,
with the screen share.
Yes, okay.
So if you stop screen share maybe, and then go back in again on the screen share, yeah.
Yeah.
I can probably help Andrew by disabling you, if that helps.
I don't know. Wait a minute. Let me try first of all what Trisha said, but I'm not being able to find the screen share at the moment. So, okay, found it. Yeah. Okay. Right. So I'll start the screen share again.
Don't forget to optimize for video and sound. Computer.
Yeah. Right.
No, you don't want the computer sound, do you?
No, I don't want the computer sound. It's muted.
So it's just the.
Right. Can you see the screen now?
We can see the screen. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just go back a bit. Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, these are some pictures of the work of Meta, which I was showing. Thought I was showing when I was explaining it. So I've already explained that, and perhaps we'll just move on a bit to. Yeah. Okay. So you can all see the screen at this point?
I can, yeah. Everyone else? Okay, yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, so the scheme that we used was definition of objectives, then defining the kind of things we're going to do to achieve those objectives, like improvements in health and education, agriculture. They generated outputs, so immediate results, and then long-term outcomes. So it would be an improvement in livelihood, incomes, nutrition, and so on. So this is a discussion working out how we're going to do this outcome measurement. And it's carried out actually in a Buddhist temple, as you can see. And that was a planning exercise and a training exercise to work out how to do that. And then we collected information from the different groups and the different projects that Meta was working with. And the technical assistance for the process was provided by me and by my wife, Jan, who focused on the report writing and so on. And the video finally was prepared by our son, Alan, who's a website developer and graphic designer. So you can see here, looking at the different projects, and we're going to focus on two particular projects. One was psychosocial support for people living with HIV/AIDS, and the other was in agriculture. We used mixed methods of research, including existing numbers that we had from the project implementation. We did qualitative investigations, in-depth interviews, and these were provided by project participants. We did regularly group assessment and text analysis of the key documents. That provided us with the data we needed to measure the outcomes. And this is the first project that I'd like to talk about. And it's a project in Kachin State in the north, which is for people living with HIV/AIDS, in fact, living through an epidemic. So we've been living through a pandemic, and they lived through an epidemic like this 10 years ago, but it wasn't COVID, it was HIV/AIDS, and it was really terrifying. These were remote mountain villages where people, young adults who were supporting families, just suddenly started dying, and nobody knew why. So it was really terrifying, and the local communities approached Meta and said, you have to help us. We don't know what's happening, and we need help. So they helped them through working out what was causing it, explaining about the nature of HIV/AIDS, that you can be tested for it. Then you can get access to antiretroviral drugs from government clinics, and where to go to get that support. And they also explained to the community that this was not, you were not going to catch it by touching people or sitting next to them. That the children of people with HIV positive, who had been tested HIV positive, would not give other children HIV if they played together in schools and so on. So this is an example of one of the participants in the program who herself tested positive and is explaining about her experience and how it affected her life. The project empowered people living with HIV/AIDS. The project helped people like that by enabling them to access health and other services. It strengthened the community prevention measures, and it built up capacity to address the social and economic challenges, which included extra poverty, additional poverty, affecting the groups of those living with HIV and AIDS. So it was a comprehensive community approach to the problem. AIDS and their families to act. And then we were able to analyze 12 testimonies given by project participants. These showed important changes which took place during the project. These were important because the Meta used testimonies to explain how it was possible to live with this condition. During the project period. These showed important changes taking place. The case study also used statistical data collected by the project, which showed a rapid increase in the number of participants. So the number of participants increased, but the number of deaths dropped quite dramatically. And in fact, it dropped by 4/5, so that after 5 years of the project, the death rate reduced by 80%, which was because essentially of more knowledge, more community support, reduction of the stigma, and access to antiretroviral drugs through clinics, government clinics. So that was a major step, a major improvement. And those who were diagnosed HIV positive were able to live with the disease, with the treatment. We think that the big reduction in mortality was partly due to the fact that in the early stages, when there was no support for people, there was quite a high suicide rate because it was a very scary experience. So this is the this is a reduction in stigma, which we measured in one of the villages. And you can see, I talked previously about the massive reduction in the mortality rate. So participants were empowered to a considerable extent, and their ability to access health facilities was increased. And in about a quarter of the project area, income generating activities increased the participants' incomes, the participants being people who are actually living with HIV/AIDS. And widespread community education measures strengthen community prevention and community capacity to address social and economic challenges. And the Buddhist groups and the Kachin Christian groups were brought together by tackling a common problem. They met for the first time in churches with both religions or in temple compounds. And then I'd like to finish this segment with a song which the community wrote and the church choir actually sang to people in large meetings of people suffering from HIV/AIDS to explain the community commitment to work together and not ostracize or stigmatize people with HIV, but actually give them support. As well as community development and livelihood and education. The second project I'd like to talk about with Meta is the Farmer Field Schools, which provided people with information about improved seed selection, care of seedlings, transplanting, and soil fertility management. And there's a second section video.
Tớ khuyên nào phang lùi lần sọ pi mình siêu rồi tớ xả lô lề này nè toàn rồi yêu đều phần tan toàn là nào yêu cụ nào nhỉ mơ lì áo hệ si từ đơn cả tớ có xong lì áo nha mình siêu nè thế này nhỉ nén si seng lần tớ mơ là xong xỉ nén chứ nào tớ thải nó không mấy ai mà tí chứ nào cùng như đa tất cả toàn là lam hồ bông này áo đấy khảm này áo ni tolo tama lớn cái này ni phá trà này tôi che mà mi lô ta là suy rắc mà bị áo đấy lùi yang thái tờ lên xong ăn thố lại bằng mông pi là tự yêu chẳng liệu ông ba thái cam là su là đấy sự cố nào si phui phải cả khuyên là phui tiền thao đấyมาทำมาเนี่ยเรินเนาะเอาละเลยกี้เนี่ย คือประมูลนะอารมณ์ตีเดินแต่ข้ามแต่คุยเท่านะเนาะมาทำไมกูมันนี่ยุ่งนะเบิร์นตะวังกับนี่ยุ่งองค์ขลังเบงนะอาจารย์นะองค์มีบ้าสมนานะแต่เนาะตัวชายเยที่ชุบนะข่าวนะแต่วินาลุยคัดเดห้องแต่เทิงอวิมึงคัดพีองค์กว่าก็อยู่เนาะเยชุบนะองค์นี่นี่แท้อะไรเนี่ยบางผู้เฮรูปมึงเนาะคุยแต่บางแต่เฮต้าใช่เนาะต้มซาปีเนาะขี้เนาะนี่สมริโตไพ่ไทยข้ามกูนั่นเองสมริโตลงแล้วก็ยิโมเยโมเนาะข้ามทงส้มหลังอันนั้นแต่เรียกข้ามแพงทงส้มหลังประสานไม่ว่าตีนั่นแหละชายสุดนั่นนะก็เลยแทงตะดึงแล้วตอนนี้จูบ้ากับไปช้ามันนี่ไปเลยเทศที่กระบี่มันนี่เนาะเลยทำไมกับไปมาจูน่ะเลยบริมันตาช้าเลยซื้อกับเทศที่กระบี่กูอันนี้ได้ถือได้แล้วก็เซิร์นกับโรบายาเนาะแต่ทำไมโรบาลินิงจังนะแต่ซาทะลุพาพ่องโปนะแต่เนี่ยชี้วางรูปยากค่ะวางห้อยคำสกิลวินาไม่มีวินาวางกับห้อยไปได้วางจ้าไปได้อัมพลูอัมพลาท่านี่เนี่ยอาแกนาวไปเนี่ยช้าเนาะนี่เนี่ยรูปนั้นได้มาสารโปได้จ้ะครับ
In Kachin State, a farmer field school with lowland paddy farmers used data collected and mapped by farmers themselves and verified by project staff, showing outcomes which included a 35% increase in yield and 20% increase in food security. In northern Shan State, the Sustainable Agriculture Project, also using farmer field schools, increased yields in upland agriculture by over 30% and reforested almost 1,000 acres of degraded land. All the 50 participating villages established their own mini-forests, and 7 have applied for government registration to keep control of their own forest land. In southern Shan State, a similar approach in 150 villages under the LIFT project produced very encouraging improvements in food security. While before the project only 40% of villages had food security of more than 9 months, afterwards this increased to 60%.
เอาโน้คำสุนาชูได้รีอันนี้ที่นเนาะวันนี้เสิร์นเพลนี่นี่เนาะแต่เจอเนาะลีชิเรียกว่านี่เจอเอาครีเอาปวานเนแต่เจอเนาะลีเมะมิวปวานี่เจอครีแต่เท่าเนี่ยมีปวายังเจอคือมีปวายังเนาะเจอคือเท่าจ้าเนี่ยมีปวายังละเดินนะตัวเนี่ยครีแต่รู้เต้าเนี่ยเนาะนี่เนาะพอให้ตีโป่งตารางไปเส้นนี้คือโพนี้คือลำพวกกันคือเดี๋ยวเจอเป็นชราไข่เป็นนี่กรีเอาเราไปค่ายเบอร์ซี่หนึ่งกับแต่เล่นตัวอีกหน่อยแต่มาเนี่ยเป็นเรื่องสีมวยนี่เนาะไม่แล้วตีโป่งตารางไปเส้นนี้เนาะนี่เนาะที่ยังอกขันปีนกระละมันนี่ตรงเบเกอรี่ค่ะนะโชว์ไปเล่นทำไมกันโชว์บาทางบางวันมึงน่ะสังกิตเนี่ยโชว์บาลำแถวบีนึกสันมือบีอ่ะเริ่มมือตันเล่นตัวไหมเอาเล่นสุดท้ายแต่ส่งมือไปจะไปเอาเดินหนีหันมือเนี่ยเฮาได้เฮาได้ก็เฮาได้สีเอานี่ทำไมน่ะสีเนาะเอ็นท่าสีเอ็นท่าเอามือลูดเดี๋ยวจะมือบ้าแล้วกันนะโชว์ไปเล่นทำไมกันมั้งโชว์บาปยาลิงหมอกแต่ผู้มองหันที่ลงเนี่ยมึงโชว์ต่อป้าตัวอย่างนะใครละตื่นนะเส้นกระชูสีขาดามวันน่ะมึงปองตะริงเส้นกระชูดาสีลงสีมาอยู่แท่งดิงานเองเนาะเรินนึแต่เลือลิงานสู้สิงเนาะมางานเนาะอีละท่าสิงกระชีเลยไปนี่เนาะอะไรเห่าไปคิงเนี่ยเลือนี่ชีเนาะละเดินนะคุยน้ำตานั่นเองเนาะตะนิง
The lessons learned from the 17 case studies show that Meta staff are able to collect the data, analyze the results, and formed an action research unit which carried out other types of relevant action research important for the future of the communities. All the case studies showed strong, verifiable, positive outcomes, as well as identifying areas for future improvement. You can see the big changes in food security from the agricultural related projects. That means people have enough to eat around the year. Low food security means they don't. And so the head office and the branch office team members work together, and the close cooperation between Meta and its partners like Christian Aid increased as a result of the case studies. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing this one and go back to the PowerPoint. Right, so that was the description and discussion of the case studies that we looked at in terms of Meta. And this is a picture of myself and my wife Jan working with the team working on HIV/AIDS. A very interesting thing about this project was that when the HIV project funding came to an end, the team just continued the project. They're all living with HIV themselves, and they decided that they would continue for the benefit of other people who were testing HIV positive and keep the program going. And by this stage, the community support had really developed and was kind of self-sustaining. So they were able to manage without any further funding. And this was a very important initiative because, as I explained earlier, living through a pandemic or an epidemic where you don't know what's causing it and nobody's helping you is really scary. And the second example that we took, which was the Christian Aid funded agricultural project, also was very effective in improving food security, reducing hunger, having people having more food to eat throughout the year, and also providing an alternative to opium production, which is very important because opium addiction in this area is potentially very damaging, and also it leads to export of opium through Thailand, which eventually leads to heroin being imported into other countries, including this one. So that was a very, meeting these people and hearing what they were doing was a very moving experience, particularly when we analyzed the data and realized they'd massively reduced the mortality rate from HIV/AIDS. So I mentioned earlier that Meta is also working extensively with internally displaced people. This is a major problem in Myanmar because the army has been very active and repressive in the ethnic minority areas. So there's been a lot of displacement from remote villages into towns. And that's a major focus of Christian Aid, as I mentioned earlier.
Really?
Okay, so then I want to talk briefly about the next stage of work that I did with Meta, because they decided to use the teams which had become trained and active during the outcome case study research to research into land resource use. This was a big issue because land, particularly in Kachin state, was being, but also in other areas like the Shan states, was being grabbed by business interests and by particularly Chinese business coming in from the north and by the military for their own purposes, and kind of making villages which had been self-sufficient on their own land, landless effectively. In some cases, so much land had been grabbed that the village people only had the land on which their houses were built, whereas before they had a large area of agricultural land which they could use to produce food for themselves. So we carried out this action research essentially with the same team. And here you can see a pipeline. This was the China-Myanmar crude oil pipeline project. The land was just taken from people. There were no compensation, no consultation, and they were prohibited from actually using that land after the pipeline was buried. So we found a rhyme from the 17th century in England, which is when a similar process was happening during the enclosure movement. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from under the goose. And that seemed an appropriate description of what was going on at that stage. In the earlier video, we mentioned that Meta was involved in community forestry of land which had been degraded and wasn't really forested anymore. And one purpose, although it was not officially declared, of that was to forest it so that the village was able to retain control over it and not have it grabbed by business for rubber plantations. This was a map drawn up by people in the village in Kachin State who were working on the land resource project, research project. And here we have an example of 160 hectares, 400 acres, just taken by the army in northern Shan State arbitrarily and to be used for plantations, basically. So people who had been self-sufficient farmers were now being forced into being low-wage laborers on plantations for the army. Women were very involved in the research, and again, the issue of women's land rights and women fully participating. This was land which had been collectively owned, and the problem was that it hadn't been registered in individual ownership plots, a bit like the land problem in Bangladesh, which I described earlier. And there was a need to investigate and change the system so that villages were able to control the land equitably among themselves and not have it grabbed by outside interests. And the purpose of the report, which emerged from the research, was then submitted to a parliamentary commission after the democratic elections when Aung San Suu Kyi's Democracy Party was elected, to try to get that incorporated into new policy changes and new changes of implementation of existing policies. And here is the group, the research group, working together, again looking at the maps and finding out how we can try to put pressure on the government to bring about necessary changes. And now finally, I'd like to briefly go back to climate change. We talked about climate change in the context of Bangladesh. It affects us all, but it particularly affects low-lying areas. Here you can see one of the houses. I mentioned earlier that houses are built on raised mounds so that when this happens, when this tidal flooding happens, they can the house survives. You can also see one of the new sanitary latrines in the foreground of the house next to the haystack, the straw stack. But this area, the protective dike has not yet been completed, so the area is still subject to periodic tidal flooding. And the sea level is rising by about 10 centimeters every 10 years. It doesn't sound like an awful lot, but it's a meter in a century, and it's increasing, the rate's increasing. This is in a country where 90% of the land is below 10 meters above sea level, and the tidal range is already 4 meters, so normal high tides are 4 meters above mean sea level. So a regular increase like this is really problematic. So Christian Aid's position is that burning fossil fuels is causing climate change and harming the planet. As you can see on the left, the result of burning fossil fuels in cars and melting glaciers, a really big issue. And Christian Aid is currently running a major climate justice campaign building up to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, which is being hosted by our government, and where we hope to see some real further progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and getting climate change under control, because climate change affects the poorest and the most vulnerable much more than the richer and the more protected in the world. And finally, I'd just like to talk about the coronavirus situation. Christian Aid has a major commitment, particularly right now in India, working with its local partners to share vital health and hygiene messages and empower communities. And it's running a national campaign or international campaign on building back with justice and dismantling inequalities after the COVID-19 epidemic. And that's been the focus since the epidemic started last year. So in India, we have a second wave of COVID. It's having a terrible impact, as you probably know from the news. Cases are rising at an alarming rate, hospitals are overrun, and oxygen supplies are falling short. Across the world, and especially in India, the most marginalized have been hit the hardest. I was in a World Bank seminar where they explained 100 million are pushed back into extreme poverty, they estimate, as a result of the pandemic. Extreme poverty is defined as people who spend more than 80% of their available income on food and still only meet less than 80% of their calorie requirements. So these are people just alive. And the number had been reducing regularly over time, but it's now jumped by 100 million. That's quite a large number in the context of the world population. So in India, the government has introduced some measures to reduce the impact of COVID, but we need to ensure that the support actually reaches people, poor people who too often get left behind due to lack of awareness, social stigma and discrimination. And you can see from the case studies or the examples of Nijarakori and Meta and the communities they work with, how that works in practice with Christian Aid support, trying to reach the most disadvantaged and help them to access the means to improve their situation. So please support the climate justice campaign, contribute to Christian Aid's work if you can, and many thanks. And I think we've reached the time limit. Just a final slide. We have a giving thanks for our vaccines in Mansfield appeals. As we achieve a high level of vaccination in this country, there's an appeal to help others, particularly in India, through Christian Aid. And the COP26 climate justice campaign, which Christian Aid is running in cooperation with many others, has a website as well. And I expect we can circulate these after the meeting through Tricia. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We've been very privileged to have you, Andrew. Thank you for sharing all that work that you've been so involved with. It's very uplifting, and thank you. And to your family as well. Thank you for that.